So what we have is people coming into acute mental health care and then going out into homelessness, and then you can imagine you're back on the street. Your health situation's going to really plummet, and so people go back into acute mental health care, and often in somewhere in that cycle, there's interactions with the police and the justice system, and so it's a messy situation that doesn't result in any kind of better outcomes. Though we do see people often spending significant amounts of time in acute mental health. So it's costing a lot of money, but the outcome isn't there. So what we're saying needs to happen is it's about providing that housing linked with support, so that when people come out of acute mental health care, they go into a home with the support they need. And we know time and again that this results in much better outcomes for people's mental wellbeing.
And give us a sense, Kate, of how many Australians at the moment are caught up in that cycle.
So look, it's about 31,000 people going around and around this cycle, but the problem just keeps getting worse. So over the past 5 years, the number of people experiencing persistent homelessness has jumped 30%, and that's partly about the housing crisis. So the more that you've got pressure in the rental market, the more competition for each of those rentals. You can imagine that the person with mental health challenges is not going to be at the top of that queue to get a rental, so they do tend to miss out. And look, we also see it in the increased number of people sleeping rough, and I think people watching will have seen that all around Australia, that there's more and more people on the street, and we see that in the data as well. So there's been a 47% spike in people who are still rough sleeping, even after they've seen a homelessness service just in the past 2 years, because we just can't get people into housing.
And Kate, one of the examples I've heard from the sector here in the ACT is part of the reason why some people end up on the street is they have to be turned away from shelters that are there if they're too violent or disruptive to others. How do we deal with that as a component, ensuring there's safety for people who are in there? And in a place like Canberra, it's so cold at this time of year that is the only option for some people to sleep rough.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think the issue that we're highlighting is that there's nowhere to go for people who have this more complex set of needs, who, are really so unwell that perhaps their behaviour's, a bit disturbed, and, other people might find them worrying. Well, then there's nowhere safe to be. So providing that kind of housing and intensive support is the solution, because a shelter doesn't work when you're in with a whole lot of other people. Being on the street obviously doesn't work. That is terrible for the person involved and can be concerning to the rest of the community, and very expensive if it ends up being a prison response when really the person is just unwell. So this is why this solution's important, but it falls between all of those different systems, and that's why it doesn't get funded. So part of what we're talking about is there's a new mental health and suicide prevention agreement being negotiated by the federal government, and that's the place to link the housing and support.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that agreement and the negotiations that are underpinning it. What have you been able to gain so far in these discussions? Are governments able to address or willing to address, it sounds like a missing middle in terms of a housing place that is suitable for people with complex needs?
It's been a really pressing challenge over a long period of time, and it's very frustrating because there's been so many reviews that have all identified the same problem. So, the NDIS review, the Royal Commission into Disability, the Productivity Commission into Mental Health, they all said basically exactly the same thing, that there's this gap, but it doesn't get funded because it sits between the housing system and the mental health system. So the reason for it to be in the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement is because it's actually also a really big problem around suicide. So 1 in 20 people who do suicide are people who've recently experienced homelessness, and actually suicide is the biggest cause of death for people who are homeless, who are dying many years younger than other Australians.
Kate Colvin from Homelessness Australia, a really important issue, one we need to try and solve. Thank you. And if you or anyone you know is feeling distressed, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. That's 13 11 14.